Rain pressed softly against the tall mullioned windows of Ashford Manor, each drop a silver thread unraveling against the darkened glass. The corridor beyond the grand staircase lay hushed in lamplight, its Persian runner swallowing the echo of cautious footsteps. She stood there, Eleanor Ashford now, though the name still felt like borrowed silk upon her shoulders, one hand braced against the carved walnut paneling, the other resting unconsciously over the slight, sacred warmth beneath her ribs. 6 weeks. A fragile beginning no one yet knew. Not even him. At 22, Eleanor possessed the quiet composure of a woman twice her years, her beauty neither flamboyant nor forgettable, but composed of soft lines and steady eyes that seemed always to be listening. She had been raised to believe that dignity was a woman's strongest armor, and tonight she wore it as one might wear a winter cloak, drawn close, clasped tightly, and not entirely sufficient. The household had retired after dinner, servants whispered below stairs, the long case clock in the entrance hall marked each passing second with indifferent authority. She had meant to knock upon her husband's study door and share the news that trembled in her heart like a small bird desperate for light. Through the narrow seam of the half-closed door, firelight flickered across the polished floor. Her husband's voice, measured, low, unmistakably controlled, cut through the murmur of rain. Edward Ashford, heir to 3 generations of land and expectation, seldom raised his tone. He had been educated to speak precisely, to reveal little, to command without spectacle. Even in private, restraint clung to him like a tailored coat. The child may not be mine. 5 words. Calmly delivered. Irrevocable. They did not thunder. They did not accuse. They simply existed, placed upon the air with devastating composure. Eleanor felt them strike not her ears but her very spine. She had never fainted in her life and she would not begin now. Instead she grew very still. The warmth beneath her palm seemed suddenly perilous, as though the secret she had cherished had turned to glass. Inside the study, another man cleared his throat, her husband's solicitor, no doubt, summoned for late accounts. Edward spoke again, quieter, as if reasoning through figures on a ledger. "It is merely prudence," he said. "I will not have the estate endangered by sentiment." Sentiment? Eleanor's breath thinned. She understood, in that sharp and silent instant, that he was not speaking of her fidelity alone. He was speaking of lineage, inheritance, the ruthless arithmetic of legacy. Their marriage, solemnized scarcely 3 months past, had been negotiated with polite smiles and familial assurances. She had entered Ashford Manor not as a beloved bride but as a suitable solution. Modest dowry, untarnished name, agreeable temperament. He had offered courtesy, provision, and an arm steady enough to guide her through society's scrutinizing gaze. Love had not been discussed. It had been presumed unnecessary. Yet she had dared to hope. In fleeting gestures, the way his gloved hand lingered a second too long at her waist during their first ball, the rare softness in his eyes when she spoke of books rather than fashion, she had sensed something unspoken, something restrained but real. Tonight she had intended to meet restraint with revelation. To tell him that within her grew the very air he valued above all else. To watch surprise soften into pride. Instead, she stood in darkness, listening to her worth weighed like grain. Her cheeks burned, though no one could see her. She retraced every hour of their brief union, searching for some misstep, some imprudence that might have birthed such doubt. There had been no scandal, no shadow of impropriety. Before marriage she had scarcely been allowed beyond her father's garden gate unchaperoned. Her reputation had been pristine, her conduct beyond reproach. Yet in a single sentence she felt herself reduced to uncertainty. Inside, chairs scraped. Papers were folded. The conversation moved on to rents and boundaries, as if the accusation had been no more than a footnote. Eleanor's heart pounded with a humiliation too profound for tears. She realized with aching clarity that Edward feared vulnerability more than dishonor. To acknowledge the child as his without question would require trust, and trust, to a man shaped by legacy, was a perilous indulgence. When at last the study door opened, she slipped silently into a recessed alcove. Edward passed without noticing her, his profile cut in stern lines against the lamplight. He looked neither cruel nor triumphant. He looked troubled, as though wrestling with an invisible adversary. For a fleeting second, she saw not a tyrant but a man cornered by his own apprehensions. It did not lessen the wound. Only when his footsteps faded did she move. She walked back down the corridor with deliberate grace, refusing the impulse to flee. Each step felt ceremonial, as though she were departing a version of herself that had existed an hour earlier, a hopeful bride rehearsing joyful news. By the time she reached her chamber, the transformation was complete. She closed the door softly and leaned against it, finally allowing her composure to tremble. The room glowed faintly with dying embers in the hearth. Her reflection in the dressing mirror appeared composed, almost serene. No evidence of upheaval marred her features. She crossed to the bed and sat carefully, palms once more curving protectively over her abdomen. "My poor brave heart," she whispered, not to herself but to the life within. "It seems we are unwelcome guests." The words did not break her, they fortified her. If doubt had entered this house tonight, she would meet it with patience rather than hysteria. She would not confront him in anger. Not yet. There was strength in silence, and she possessed more of it than he knew. Still, beneath her resolve lay a fragile ache, the knowledge that the man whose name she bore had chosen caution over faith. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant fields, low and ominous. Eleanor extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the storm gather. Somewhere within the vastness of Ashford Manor, Edward paced his study alone, unaware that his careful words had already reached their intended heir. And as the rain deepened into a relentless whisper against the stone, Eleanor understood that by morning she must decide whether to guard her secret, or risk placing her wounded heart back into the hands that had just doubted it. Morning arrived at Ashford Manor with deceptive gentleness, pale winter sunlight spilling across frost-silvered lawns as though nothing fragile had fractured in the night. Eleanor descended the grand staircase with measured composure, her gloved hand gliding along the polished banister, her expression serene enough to quiet the curious glance of a passing footman. She had slept little, yet no shadow betrayed her unrest. If Edward Ashford prized restraint above sentiment, she would offer him restraint in abundance. He stood at the breakfast table when she entered, tall and immaculately dressed, his dark coat fitting him with military precision. The firelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, revealing a fatigue he had not mastered as thoroughly as his posture. He bowed slightly as custom required. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford." His tone was courteous, neither warm nor cold. It was the tone of a man maintaining distance with surgical care. "Good morning, sir," she replied, allowing the faintest inclination of her head. Silverware chimed against porcelain. Steam rose from untouched tea. Between them lay the long mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting two figures bound by marriage yet separated by invisible suspicion. Eleanor watched him from beneath lowered lashes. There was calculation in his quiet today, as though he were measuring her reactions, searching for signs of guilt where none existed. Before silence could thicken further, the door opened to admit Lady Whitcomb, Edward's widowed aunt and the unofficial custodian of Ashford propriety. Her eyes were keen, her smile composed of sharpened courtesy. "How delightful to see such domestic harmony," she observed lightly, settling into her seat. "One can never be too certain how swiftly blessings may arrive after a wedding." The remark floated with poisonous sweetness. Eleanor felt the air shift. Edward's hand tightened fractionally around his cup, though he did not look at his aunt. "Ashford has always welcomed blessings," he said evenly, "provided they are genuine." The implication landed without flourish. Lady Whitcomb arched a brow, clearly entertained by the undercurrent she sensed but did not yet comprehend. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "One prays that integrity is rarely in doubt," she said, her voice soft yet unwavering. A flicker passed across Edward's expression, surprise perhaps at her composure. The battle between them remained bloodless, yet it had begun. The remainder of breakfast unfolded beneath polite trivialities. Yet when Eleanor rose to depart, a footman entered bearing a small velvet case upon a silver tray. "For Mrs. Ashford," he announced. Eleanor's pulse quickened despite herself. Edward did not speak. His eyes, however, were fixed upon the box with deliberate intent. She opened it slowly. Within rested a delicate gold locket, oval and finely wrought, suspended from a slender chain. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, the metal warm against the cool air. Eleanor's breath faltered as she opened the clasp. Inside, engraved in precise lettering, were the words, "For the mother of my heir." The room seemed to narrow. Lady Whitcomb made a small sound of approval. "How thoughtful," she murmured. "Edward, you never fail to anticipate the future." Eleanor lifted her gaze to her husband. "You presume much, sir." His voice remained steady. "I prepare for eventualities." The distinction between presumption and preparation hung sharp as glass. She closed the locket gently. The gift was not tenderness, it was possession. It claimed a future while questioning the present. Yet beneath the calculated gesture lay something else, a thread of desire for certainty, perhaps even for hope. He would not have commissioned such an inscription without at least entertaining belief. "I thank you," she said, fastening the chain around her neck without assistance. For a fleeting instant, his eyes darkened, not with suspicion this time, but with something dangerously close to pride. The shift unsettled them both. That evening, Ashford Manor hosted a modest gathering, a dinner long planned and impossible to postpone. Candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, casting liquid gold across silk gowns and polished boots. Conversation shimmered, brittle and bright. Eleanor entered at Edward's side, the locket resting against her collarbone like a quiet declaration. Whispers traveled swiftly among the guests. She felt them brush against her shoulders like cold drafts. A young gentleman approached, Mr. Frederick Hale, a distant acquaintance from her girlhood village, known more for earnest smiles than impropriety. He bowed deeply. "Mrs. Ashford, you look radiant this evening." "You are kind," she replied. "I trust the country air agrees with you," he added, perhaps too warmly. Edward's presence at her side became unmistakable. "It agrees exceedingly well," he answered for her, his tone cordial yet edged with steel. Frederick faltered, sensing territory guarded. He excused himself quickly, leaving behind the faint scent of embarrassment. Eleanor turned to her husband. "There was no offense intended." "I decide what constitutes offense," Edward replied quietly. The possessiveness in his words startled her more than anger would have. His hand settled at the small of her back, firm and unyielding, guiding her toward the supper room. The gesture was unmistakably intimate. Conversations paused as they passed. He was claiming her. Not tentatively, not cautiously, but publicly. Throughout dinner, he remained near, intercepting glances, silencing insinuations with measured civility. The same man who had questioned her fidelity now stood as her unspoken defender. Eleanor struggled to reconcile the contradiction. Was he protecting his name, or her dignity? As the evening waned, she felt the subtle weight of his scrutiny soften. Once, when laughter erupted across the table, she caught him studying her profile with an expression unguarded and almost reverent. The sight unsettled her more deeply than his suspicion had. When the final carriage departed and the manor quieted, Eleanor removed her gloves in the entry hall. Edward lingered nearby, uncharacteristically hesitant. "You conducted yourself with admirable grace," he said at last. "Grace is often expected of those under examination," she replied. A faint shadow of regret crossed his face. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion lining his eyes. "I will not have you made a spectacle." "I already have been," she answered softly. Silence expanded between them, charged and fragile. His hand lifted as though to touch the locket, then fell away. Without another word, he turned and ascended the staircase, leaving her alone beneath the fading candlelight. Eleanor pressed her fingers against the engraved gold at her throat. "For the mother of my heir." The words no longer felt solely like a claim of possession. They felt like a promise he was not yet brave enough to voice aloud. Upstairs, a door closed firmly. And for the first time since she had heard those 5 devastating words, Eleanor wondered whether the greater danger lay not in his doubt, but in the possibility that he was already beginning to believe. The house slept beneath a ceiling of low clouds, and Ashford Manor seemed carved from shadow and silence. Eleanor lay wakeful, listening to the wind comb its fingers through the barren branches beyond her window. The locket rested cool against her skin, its engraved promise both shield and accusation. She could not endure another day suspended between suspicion and ceremony. If her marriage were to survive, it would not be by silence alone. Near midnight she rose, wrapped herself in a dark wool shawl, and crossed the corridor toward Edward's study. Light flickered beneath the door, steady and unyielding. He had not sought her chamber that evening. He had retreated instead to ledgers and correspondence, to ink and arithmetic, to the orderly world where figures did not wound him with uncertainty. She knocked once and entered before hesitation could claim her courage. Edward stood beside the hearth, coat removed, waistcoat unbuttoned at the throat as though the air itself oppressed him. The fire cast copper light across his face, revealing strain he would never permit in daylight. He looked startled, not by her presence alone but by the resolve in her posture. "Eleanor," he said, recovering his composure. "It is late." "So is truth," she replied quietly. The words struck him into stillness. She stepped farther into the room, closing the door behind her. The latch sounded decisive like the sealing of a pact. "I will not speak in riddles," she continued. "I heard you last night." Color drained from his expression, though he did not avert his gaze. "You heard?" the child may not be mine. She repeated the sentence without tremor, giving it back to him as one returns a blade. The silence that followed was heavier than accusation. Edward drew a slow breath. You were not meant to hear that. Then it should not have been spoken. Her restraint, more than fury would have, unsettled him. He moved toward the desk as though seeking structure in its polished surface. You misapprehend my intention. Then enlighten me, sir. He looked at her fully now, and she saw not arrogance but conflict. I have spent my life safeguarding this estate, he said. Every decision measured. Every alliance considered. I have witnessed how quickly a name may crumble beneath scandal. Prudence is not cruelty. And doubt is not prudence, she replied. It is fear. The word hovered between them. Edward's jaw tightened. You speak boldly. I carry your child, she said, pressing her palm to her abdomen with unmistakable clarity. Boldness becomes necessity. For the first time, his gaze dropped to the subtle curve of her form, as though truly seeing it rather than calculating it. Something in his expression shifted, uncertainty pierced by dawning comprehension. You are certain? He asked, the question stripped of accusation and edged instead with awe. I intended to tell you the very hour I heard you speak otherwise. The confession fractured his composure more effectively than anger could have done. He turned away briefly, one hand braced against the mantel. I did not doubt your virtue, he said at last, voice lower. I doubted my fortune. She watched him carefully. Explain. He faced her again, and in the firelight he appeared less a lord of land than a man unarmored. My mother bore 3 sons, he began. Only I survived infancy. I was raised to expect loss before joy. I learned early that hope is a liability. The admission surprised her more than any denial might have. When you spoke of children in those early weeks, he continued, I found myself wanting what I had sworn never to anticipate. And when the possibility arose so swiftly, I mistrusted it. Not you. The blessing. Eleanor absorbed this quietly. His fear was not of betrayal, but of attachment. To claim the child as his beyond question would be to invite vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one risk he had never permitted himself. You would rather guard your heart than risk its breaking, she said. Yes. And in doing so, you nearly broke mine. The words landed without rancor, yet they struck deeply. He crossed the space between them then, stopping close enough that the heat of the fire warmed them both. If I have wronged you, he said, each syllable deliberate, it was in cowardice, not suspicion. She searched his face for evasion and found none. You spoke of the estate as though it were flesh and blood, she said softly. But this child is flesh and blood. His hand lifted, hesitated, then settled tentatively over hers where it rested upon her abdomen. The touch was reverent, almost fearful. If this life is mine, he murmured, then it is the first gift I have ever desired without calculation. Emotion tightened her throat, yet she held his gaze. It is yours, she said simply. A long breath left him, unsteady and profound. In that exhale she sensed the crumbling of a fortress long maintained. He did not kneel, nor did he dramatize repentance. Edward Ashford was not fashioned for grand gestures. Instead, he bowed his head slightly as though acknowledging an authority greater than pride. I will not speak those words again, he vowed, nor permit them to be spoken by another. The promise was quiet but absolute. Eleanor felt something within her shift, not forgiveness entirely but the opening of a door. Trust cannot be commanded, she replied. It must be chosen. Then I choose it, he said. For a moment the world narrowed to the circle of firelight and their joined hands. The manor's vast corridors, the expectations of lineage, the whispering society beyond its walls, all seemed distant. Here stood a man who had feared hope and a woman who had nearly been undone by his fear. Yet as the fire settled into embers, another thought intruded upon Eleanor's fragile relief. Words once spoken cannot be unheard. Doubt once introduced does not vanish without consequence. She withdrew her hand gently. We have chosen trust tonight, she said. Let us see whether morning will honor it. Edward regarded her with an intensity newly unguarded. It shall, he answered. But as she turned toward the door, she wondered whether the greater test lay not within these walls, but beyond them, where whispers traveled faster than vows, and one careless sentence might yet awaken the very scandal he feared most. The morning after their midnight reckoning dawned brittle and bright, as though the sky itself had been scrubbed clean by unseen hands. Eleanor stood before her dressing mirror while her maid secured the final pins in her hair, noting the faint bloom of color return to her cheeks. Trust had been chosen in firelight, yet daylight demanded proof. Ashford Manor would host a small luncheon that afternoon. Neighbors, distant cousins, and those observant eyes that thrived upon nuance. If doubt had ever lingered in Edward's voice, society must never taste it. When Eleanor descended the staircase, she found Edward waiting in the entrance hall, gloved hands clasped behind his back. His expression held the composure of habit, yet something warmer stirred beneath it. He studied her as one might regard a fragile masterpiece restored from neglect. "You appear well," he said. "I am well," she replied, and meant it. He stepped forward without hesitation and adjusted the fall of the gold locket at her throat, centering it with deliberate care. The gesture, though small, carried the intimacy of confession. A passing footman lowered his gaze discreetly. Edward did not withdraw his hand at once. "Remain near me today," he murmured. "I will not have you stand alone." "I have never stood alone," she answered softly. "I merely feared you had." His eyes flickered with remorse, then hardened with resolve. Whatever frailty had haunted him the night before was now transmuted into purpose. Carriages began to arrive by noon, wheels crunching over frost-kissed gravel. Guests entered in rustling silks and tailored coats, bringing with them the faint scent of winter roses and speculation. Lady Whitcomb presided near the hearth, her expression sharp with curiosity. Mr. Frederick Hale appeared once more, polite yet watchful. Eleanor felt the atmosphere tighten, threads of rumor weaving silently between glances. Edward greeted each guest with measured cordiality, yet his attention remained tethered to his wife. When Lady Whitcomb remarked with airy sweetness, "One trusts the Ashford lineage shall flourish promptly," the room quieted almost imperceptibly. "It already flourishes," Edward replied, his voice calm but resonant. "My wife carries my child." The declaration did not thunder, it settled like a seal upon parchment. Gasps fluttered across the drawing room. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, not from shame but from the audacity of his claim. He had chosen not only trust but proclamation. Lady Whitcomb's smile faltered. "How very expeditious." Edward's gaze sharpened. "Fortune does not consult timetables, aunt. Nor does loyalty." The word loyalty struck deeper than any accusation could have. Eleanor sensed the subtle shift among the guests, curiosity dissolving into constrained approval. Frederick Hale inclined his head respectfully and withdrew from further conversation, recognizing a boundary firmly drawn. Throughout the meal, Edward remained attentive without suffocation. He ensured Eleanor's glass was filled, her chair positioned comfortably, her exposure to draughts minimized. Each gesture was practical, yet collectively they formed a quiet defense. Where once he had measured her with caution, he now guarded her with conviction. After dessert, as the guests dispersed into smaller conversations, Lady Whitcomb approached Eleanor privately. "You must forgive a widow's vigilance," she said, her tone softer than before. "The Ashford name has endured much." "So have I," Eleanor replied gently. The older woman studied her, perhaps recognizing a resilience she had previously overlooked. "Take care, child," she advised, though whether the warning was kindly meant remained uncertain. When the final carriage departed and the heavy doors closed against the chill, silence returned like a held breath released. Edward stood beside Eleanor in the empty drawing room, sunlight slanting through tall windows to gild the dust motes in its path. "You have altered the narrative," she said quietly. "I have corrected it," he replied. She faced him fully. "Public words bind more tightly than private vows." "I am aware." There was no bravado in his tone, only acknowledgement. He had wagered his pride upon her integrity, and in doing so had dismantled the last barrier between them. He reached again for the locket, this time unfastening it carefully. Eleanor's breath caught, uncertain. Instead of removing it entirely, he turned it over, revealing the inscription to her once more. "For the mother of my heir," he read aloud, then met her gaze. "I engraved those words before doubt ever entered my mind. I ordered it the day I first imagined you with child." Emotion rippled through her, swift and unexpected. "Then why speak otherwise?" "Because imagining happiness is easier than trusting it." The honesty in his voice disarmed her more thoroughly than apology could have. He refastened the chain and allowed his fingers to rest briefly against her pulse. "I will not retreat again," he said. "Not before family. Not before society. Not before you." The declaration carried neither flourish nor extravagance, yet it resonated like a vow renewed. Eleanor felt the subtle recalibration of their union. What had begun as arrangement now edged toward partnership. Yet beneath her relief lingered a faint unease. Words spoken in a drawing room travel swiftly beyond it. A public claim invites public scrutiny. As though summoned by that thought, a footman entered bearing a sealed envelope upon a silver tray. "For Mr. Ashford," he announced. Edward accepted it, his brow furrowing at the unfamiliar seal. He broke it open and scanned its contents, the color draining slowly from his face. Eleanor watched the transformation with tightening breath. "What is it?" He lowered the paper, his expression no longer resolute but troubled in a manner she had not yet witnessed. "A letter from our family physician," he said quietly. "He requests to see us at once." The room seemed to contract around them. "Is there cause for alarm?" she asked. Edward folded the letter with deliberate care, though his hand betrayed the faintest tremor. "He writes that certain early signs require caution." The word caution echoed with haunting familiarity. Edward met her gaze, and for a heartbeat the fortress within him threatened to rise again. Then, slowly, he extended his hand toward her. "We shall face it together," he said. Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling both the strength and the uncertainty in his grip. The storm they had weathered in whispers now gathered in quieter, more insidious form. Outside, clouds began to gather once more above Ashford Manor, and Eleanor understood with chilling clarity that trust had been declared, but it was about to be tested. The letter lay between them like a verdict awaiting execution. Edward did not release Eleanor's hand as he led her from the drawing room, his stride purposeful yet tempered to her pace. The fragile piece forged in firelight now trembled beneath the weight of medical caution. He had defended her before society with unwavering voice. Now he must defend her against fate itself. They departed within the hour. The carriage wheels cut through damp gravel as clouds thickened overhead, turning afternoon into premature dusk. Inside the carriage, silence stretched taut, but it was no longer hostile. Edward's gloved thumb traced absent circles against Eleanor's knuckles, a gesture unconscious yet intimate. She studied his profile, the firm brow, the mouth disciplined by habit, and saw beneath it the tremor of a man confronting forces he could neither command nor negotiate. "You need not conceal your fear from me," she said gently. He exhaled slowly. "I do not fear scandal," he answered. "I fear loss." The confession carried no ornament. It was simple and devastating. She rested her free hand over her abdomen, as though reminding them both of the quiet life depending upon their composure. "Then let us be brave in equal measure." His gaze softened, gratitude flickering across features so often schooled in reserve. "You shame me with your courage," he murmured. "I steady you with it," she corrected. The physician's residence stood modest yet orderly at the edge of the village, its windows lit against gathering rain. They were admitted at once into a study scented faintly with camphor and polished wood. Dr. Hargreaves, a silver-haired gentleman whose reputation rested upon discretion, greeted them with grave solemnity. "I regret summoning you in such haste," he began, indicating chairs near the hearth. "But early symptoms, if neglected, may invite danger." Edward remained standing. "Speak plainly." The physician inclined his head. "Mrs. Ashford must avoid strain of any kind, emotional or physical. There are signs of weakness. It is not uncommon in early pregnancy, yet it requires vigilance. Rest. Come. Protection from distress." Eleanor absorbed the counsel without flinching. "And if such vigilance is observed? The child may progress safely," he replied. "But agitation could jeopardize both mother and infant." The word struck Edward with visible force. Agitation. Distress. Doubt. He understood instantly that his earlier suspicion had not been merely a moral wound, it had been a physical risk. "We shall observe every precaution," he said, voice steady but edged with steel. The physician studied them both, perhaps noting the shift in the young husband's bearing. "Then I expect a favorable outcome." Rain lashed against the windows as they departed, as though nature itself underscored the fragility of hope. In the carriage, Edward's composure fractured for the first time. He removed his gloves abruptly, pressing bare fingers to his temples. "This is my doing," he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "You are not master of biology." "But I am master of this household," he replied. "And I permitted doubt to take residence within it." The self-reproach in his tone cut deeper than any accusation. She reached across the narrow space and stilled his restless hands. "Listen to me," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Fear is not cruelty unless it is chosen over love. You have not chosen fear." His eyes met hers, dark with unshed anguish. "I nearly did. But you did not." The carriage slowed as they approached Ashford Manor. Thunder rolled across the fields, echoing the storm that had once accompanied her humiliation. Yet tonight the storm felt different, not isolating but unifying. Upon entering the manor, Edward issued quiet instructions to the staff. No disturbances, no visitors, no unnecessary exertion for Mrs. Ashford. His authority bore new texture, not rigid command but vigilant devotion. He accompanied Eleanor to her chamber and dismissed her maid with a nod that brooked no argument. When they were alone, the vastness of the room seemed suddenly intimate. "You must rest," he said softly. She sat upon the edge of the bed, studying him. "And you?" "I shall remain." The simplicity of the promise unraveled something fragile within her. She had prepared herself for solitude. Instead, she found companionship. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. Edward occupied the armchair beside her bed, ledgers forgotten, gaze fixed upon her steady breathing. When she stirred, he rose instantly. When thunder shook the panes, he crossed to ensure no draught reached her. Near midnight, pain seized her suddenly, a sharp, breath-stealing cramp that bent her forward with a stifled cry. Edward was at her side in an instant. "Eleanor." She clutched his arm, fear flashing unguarded across her face. "It is nothing," she attempted, though her pallor betrayed her. He rang for assistance, voice commanding yet strained. Servants hurried, warm cloths were fetched. The physician summoned once more. Edward refused to leave her side even when propriety suggested otherwise. "Look at me," he urged as another wave of discomfort rippled through her. "Stay with me." "I am here," she whispered. Time fractured into fragments. Footsteps, murmured instructions, the relentless pounding of rain. Edward felt utterly powerless, stripped of title and land, reduced to a man bargaining silently with heaven. When at last the physician examined her and straightened, his expression eased fractionally. "The crisis has passed," he announced. "She must remain supine and undisturbed, but the child endures." Relief struck Edward with staggering force. He bowed his head briefly, mastering emotion before it overtook him. Once the room quieted and servants withdrew, he remained seated beside Eleanor, her hand cradled in both of his. "I spoke of prudence," he said hoarsely. "Yet I have never known terror until tonight." She managed a faint smile. "Now you understand hope." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against her hand. "If heaven tests me again," he murmured, "it shall not find me doubting." Tears shimmered in her eyes, not from pain but from the magnitude of his surrender. "Then we are both remade," she whispered. Dawn crept pale and fragile across the horizon, filtering through rain-washed glass. The storm had broken, leaving behind air sharp with renewal. Edward had not slept. He had not loosened his hold upon her hand. In the hush of that emerging light, he rose and knelt beside the bed, not in dramatics but in reverence. "I loved you before I possessed the courage to name it," he said quietly. "I feared that loving you would render me vulnerable. Instead, it has made me resolute." Eleanor's breath caught. "This child," he continued, placing his palm gently over her abdomen, "is not merely my heir. It is our testament. And I will guard both with every breath entrusted to me." Outside, the first birds dared to sing. Eleanor watched the man before her, not the distant lord who once weighed her worth in whispers, but the husband forged through fear and nearly undone by loss. The storm had not destroyed them, it had revealed them. Yet as sunlight strengthened and the manor stirred awake, she understood that vigilance would remain their companion. Love had been declared, devotion proven, but fragility lingered still. Edward rose slowly, his hand never leaving hers. And in that quiet, rain-washed morning, they faced not a perfect future, but one fiercely, irrevocably chosen.